Hello, everyone. And as always, welcome back to my channel. So, today we are going to continue our conversation about angels. Now, this is about three lectures into this series. We started out a few weeks ago talking about your guardian angel or your personal angel with this lecture here. And I'll link this below. And then I did another lecture focusing on the concept of the spirit guide. Now, this second lecture is on my private members website. I presented it just for my members. So that's not on YouTube. So if you want to watch that one, you're going to have to be a member and sign up for that special one. So in the first two lectures, I delineated the difference between a concept of the spirit guide, which is like a saint or a deceased relative or a spiritual being that can assist you in your life for a period of time, but wouldn't qualify as like your guardian angel. Your guardian angel is a separate being as well, that is part of the angelic hierarchies, that is actually united with your soul, that's actually united with your astral body. So, when we're actually considering spiritual development, we do have to have an understanding of esoteric anatomy. And I've also spoken about this on my channel many different times. I have a free class for members called The Four Bodies, which describes the different spiritual bodies. Because when we understand the spiritual bodies, when we understand esoteric anatomy, we can understand initiation science or how the human being actually evolves over time. Now, this is missing from modern spirituality. You can have conversations all day long about spiritual topics, about the spiritual planes, about esoteric history, about your personal experiences, about someone else's personal experiences, about near death experiences, about the underworld. You can talk about any topic you want in spirituality, but that doesn't make it spiritual. What makes a topic spiritual, genuinely spiritual, is that it produces life. It produces initiation and it produces attunement. So it must actually produce an exalted effect in the human being for it to genuinely be spiritual. So you can see that again, you can talk about all kinds of different topics that involve other dimensions or spiritual beings. But these discussions don't necessarily produce the evolution of the human being. Now, this gets into the reality of stewardship, and that when we discuss these things, we want to make sure that we're discussing them in a way in which it benefits us, in which it advances us, in which it evolves us. Otherwise, we're just sort of getting lost in curiosity and lower impulses and a sort of unmitigated, pointless search for knowledge that's only really serving the ego rather than the actual advancement of you, meaning you becoming an immortal soul, you becoming an immortal human being. And I have two lectures on the development of the immortal body on my channel presently, so that that can be there for you as well. So we have to understand spiritual beings in a very specific way that produces initiation, that produces the advancement of our essence, okay, of our being. And how we do that is we have to see humanity as linked and united and part of the spiritual hierarchies. So let's take a look at this famous image again. So you can see that man is actually directly united with what are called the spiritual hierarchies. And these are the angels that are in different classes. And right above man, you can see are the angels. or the spirits of twilight, or the angeloi in esoteric Christianity. And we're actually operating within all of these beings. So we're not functioning in a cosmos of random waves and energy and neutral forces that we one day learn to control with our mind. That's materialism. We're actually operating inside of the bodies of all of these beings, which are just as conscious and alive as you are, but at a different stage of development. And through the spiritual hierarchies, we understand what Rudolf Steiner would call initiation science, or initiation science in Christian esotericism. So when we look at the human being, we actually see ourselves as united with spiritual beings called angels that are greater than ourselves. And these angels are united with everything around us, with nature itself, and with the human being, and we're all evolving in tandem together, right? So if we don't have this perspective, we're going to fall prey to all kinds of really bizarre cosmologies that don't advance your soul. You just get caught in these fits of fantasy, and it's not actually evolving you because it's not drawing you closer and closer to the reality of the cosmos, right? And this comes from like the idea of, you don't have a personal angel. You just have your higher self. We do have a higher self. We do have a kind of perfected self. And in Anthroposophy, this is called the I, the true ego, or the I am. This is the perfected part of your consciousness that is united with the Christ. Now, this part of you works down upon into all of your lower bodies. So yes, you do have a higher self, but it's not fully integrated. It is working into, but to integrate our highest aspects, we need the assistance of angels who have already achieved these different things. And so we need that assistance, and how that happens is that they unite and are part of our spiritual bodies. They are part of us. So we have to understand this esoteric anatomy so that we may participate in it directly. If you're not understanding the esoteric anatomy of your core self, of your bodies, you're not directly participating in it. You cannot directly participate in a process unless you understand it. So a lot of people are functioning unconsciously. They're in an unconscious stage of development, even if they can talk about all of these different spiritual beings and chakras and this and dimensions and whatever it is. If you can't actually envision and understand the structure of your being and the cosmos as it is, objectively, then you're not directly participating in it. You're participating from an unconscious place. And we are called in our time to directly participate in spiritual life from a place of consciousness and even maybe clairvoyance. So in the first lecture, I focused on your guardian angel, and I went over all of the little myths and I think misunderstandings and everything that is maybe we get right, maybe we get wrong, kind of cleaning that up. And then in the second lecture, which I did for members, we talked about the history of the spirit guide and the Victorian seance room and how the spirit guide came to be in mysticism, and how eventually the spirit guide and the guardian angel were kind of conflated until the idea of the guardian angel completely disappeared. And it was no longer talked about except for in some Christian circles. And then it just became about spirit guides. And then it became about eventually aliens. And now aliens, the concept of aliens or extraterrestrial beings, are now taking over the concept of the spiritual hierarchies. People go back into religious texts of all different religions, and they take points in which the archangels are spoken about or an angel is spoken about, and they say that's an alien. They're now talking about the spiritual body, which develops, the glorified human body, which is sometimes called the resurrection body. In the New Age, it's called a Merkaba. That's now compared to a UFO or a spaceship. So we have the distinct dissolution of the spiritual hierarchies and the glorification of a human being in the image of aliens and technology, which is essentially an externalist, transhumanist image. This is something that we have to confront in our time, and we can understand, why we're dealing with that, because obviously these are topics that we're interested in ourselves, right? We're interested in science and technology and exploration and things like that. So now we're reimagining the spiritual world in that way. We're projecting it. Okay, so today we are going to get into how we have seen angels over time, because I think where we get kind of caught up, we get kind of snagged, is that we tend to think that the perception that we have now is the same perception that we had in earlier periods, and how the earth and heaven appear to us, say, 5,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, is the same as it does today. And so there's a tendency for humanity to think that we operate in a fragment and not include any conception of humanity's future development, where we're going, which is associated with initiation science, and also no inclusion of our prior conditions of development. These things aren't considered often. And we will, in very unfortunate cases, you take our current consciousness and you just project it infinitely forward and backwards, which is part of materialism and literalism, which is not even close to how we view these things spiritually, not even close. So we're going to get into the evolution of the guardian angel over time, and touching on even archangels over time, and how in early humanity it's actually very interesting. So before the incarnation of Christ, humanity operated in a very different way. And this is considered a kind of lunar condition, or a collectivist condition, a tribal condition, a hive mind. And the individual wasn't developed. People didn't really think of themselves as individuals, they didn't operate as individuals. And this was fine. This was perfect for where humanity was at that time and what was required for humanity to develop during those phases. There's nothing wrong with this condition, just like there's nothing wrong with our current condition or a future condition. It is what it is for that time, right? We just start to get into problems, like the problem of evil, when certain conditions progress and start mixing with others. That's where you get the idea and concept of evil. Something out of time forcing itself into this one with a different order of affairs, a different nature that competes with truth. So we're going to get into this evolution of how we existed in this earlier condition in a tribal consciousness, in a complete and total hive mind, and then over time began more and more and more to individuate, become more embodied, and individuate from the tribe. Now, individuation is not bad, it's not evil. It doesn't represent some kind of lack of compassion for the whole. It doesn't represent like some psychotic person that's only thinking of themselves. That's not real individuation. That's just a personality disorder. So, real individuation means that you finally become self conscious, you finally become self aware. And from that place of self awareness, you can take responsibility for your actions fully, and you can begin to overcome your lower urges, your lower conditions, the animal parts of you, if you will. You become a direct participant in your life and in the world, and you can do direct critical thinking, you can do calculations, combinations, and you can analyze things, which is unique to an individuated individual, which in anthroposophy is called the consciousness soul. The consciousness soul. So this is when a human being begins to become self-aware. And now, believe it or not, a large portion of humanity is just getting into this condition and is only slowly becoming more self-aware, more self-conscious. And we can see that because one of the glaring problems of our culture is this contrast between people who can separate from the tribe and those who can't. People who feel absolutely terrified to go against the status quo, to disagree with friends, to disagree with family, who find this kind of comfort and necessity in needing to be in a tribe and feel absolutely terrified to make their own decisions, to do their own calculations, to critically think and then trust their own conclusions. So, a lot of good and evil in our society is between the journey to individuate and those who refuse to individuate and instead are living in this old condition of just going with the latest thing, when that condition is something that the human being at this point in time should be overcoming, should be transmuting. And self awareness and self consciousness is the key quality that should be developed during this time in order to move forward. And this is also why the images of evil are things like going back into the Borg, going back into the hive mind of these earlier conditions of humanity, not being able to progress forward out of it. And so now the consolidation of the soul into the Borg, into this now technologically forced hive mind. That's why that's an image of evil in our time, is because it really represents the consolidation through technology, through matter, through the mineral kingdom of the prior condition of humanity, or the lunar condition of humanity. That's our image of evil. Our image of evil is this collectivist state turned transhuman, because nobody will choose transhumanism that is individuated. Nobody will choose transhumanism that is self-conscious. There's certain paths in culture that a self-conscious, self-aware person will not be able to choose, because they'll feel it immediately will create a destruction of their soul. So we see this contrast between self-awareness and unconsciousness and needing to be in the tribe. Now, most people are actually still trapped in this tribal way of being, but um, the more that evil bears down on humanity, the more contrast there is, the more we begin to potentially wake up, as the pressure of remaining unconscious becomes more painful than just waking up. And that's sort of where we are. So that's a little bit of a brief on the classical evolution of human consciousness over time, beginning in a collectivist state, severely so in the Lemurian epoch in the beginning of the earth, and then slowly reaching to more and more of an individual state, reaching the peak of individuation, or the peak of sort of um, the idea of consciousness, soul, and self awakening when we get the incarnation of Christ. And then that individuation proliferating into glorification, the glorification of the human being in his image as we move forward. So we're going to look at how angels in this scheme, the scheme of moving from a collective condition to an individual condition, how angels were viewed. Because again, that this is probably one of the most confused topics of our age. And we really have to understand the idea of the angels and the spiritual hierarchy and the evolution of the earth to confront a lot of the severely distorted and delusional materialist paradigms that are coming our way. That are, quite frankly, if you watch Occulted, that delusional materialist perspective is part of the evil that we face, which is sort of like this inverted materialistic interpretation of the hierarchies and true human immortality. Okay, so So the interesting thing about the evolution of sort of our perception of the angels, and especially the personal angel, is that in the earliest conditions of consciousness, of in the earlier conditions of human beings, because we weren't yet individuated, we actually didn't really perceive our personal angel. We didn't really perceive the personal angel or the guardian angel or have a real concept of it. We don't get that concept until right leading up to the incarnation and after, because we start to get these different faculties upon the incarnation. So before that period, humanity actually perceived more so the archangels. And the archangels would rule and guide groups. So you would be more concerned with your tribal angel, the angel of your tribe, the angel of your clan, the angel of your city, the angel of your location, the angel of your family, the angel of your group, the angel of your people, the angel of your race. So people operated as groups, and they therefore perceived more so the archangels, or in anthroposophy, you can call that the folk spirit, the folk spirit. So, this is how people perceive the spiritual plane and interacted with it, was as a group, and then they had these archangels that they would communicate with and be led by, and different people were led by literally different kinds of angels. And this is why you have different cultures that highlight different aspects of God that aren't actually in any kind of competition with one another. They're not better than one another. They're just bringing forward different qualities of God, right? They're preserving a different aspect of God in their being and in their nature, because they have a different folk spirit in which they are working under and expressing. And so you don't have, the further you go back, this idea of, these really rich teachings involving the guardian angel. This is completely unique to the last, 3,000 years. Well, actually, probably like less, but as you'll see, that's when you start to get the first people speaking about it. People like Plato and Plutarch, and you get the Hermetic um, age. So people would, instead of perceiving that guardian angel as we do today and praying to them and seeing their guardian angel as connected with them and directly working with them from this place of personal responsibility, that perspective was not yet there. And instead, the groups, the tribe, would seek to understand, embody, and work with the archangel that ruled over all of them, or that influenced all of them. Its impulses were in them. Okay. And this also explains why, especially when you go back into like the Eastern cultures, which really kicked off the post-Atlantean epoch, that were deeply clairvoyant, deeply spiritual, you do get a very different feel of how they saw the world as deeply clairvoyant people, and as a culture that the spiritual world was very obvious. So when you read the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, you read these different Eastern texts, you really get this sense of immersion with the spiritual world. You really get this sense of immersion and being embedded with the angels, because that's how they saw things. And then as you move further and further forward in time, you get this movement towards individuation until the East gives way to the West, and the West picks up the torch and begins the teaching of the individual. We get Christ, and then near the end of the planet's evolution, the East and West will unite again and will kind of come full circle. Okay, so that's sort of the outline of things in esoteric science. So there's also a change in perception over time from a group consciousness in which you know that you are an individual because you have a separate body. That's obvious, but you don't act as an individual. You don't behave as an individual, and you don't perceive yourself as an individual. And because of that, there are certain spiritual processes that were not available to humanity in earlier periods of development, because certain spiritual secrets and processes can only be perceived and worked upon at certain stages. So, this is why, again, we really have to understand this evolution of humanity in time, developing higher perception, losing certain um, perception, gaining others. This is really how we have to view things. Otherwise, we become very confused, which is often what happens. So, the individuated man, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the East or the West, everybody is individuated, everybody is developing consciousness, soul. The individuated person has a different kind of perception and spiritual life and task than if we go back like 6, 7,000 years, and even 3, 4,000 years. We're really looking at a humanity that was not yet seeing things as an individual, right? And if you look at even our culture, we still see some of the biggest problems come from trying to operate in a tribal way and saying, like, my particular group is better than your group. Right. This is pure tribalism, and it's completely archaic and inappropriate for the time. And that kind of thinking is evil, right? You can't say because I have a certain kind of blood, because I'm a certain kind of person, I am better than you. This is the mindset and the sort of intuitive, impulsive way of being of someone who has not yet reached the level of individuation. They are not self-conscious. They have not really achieved consciousness soul. So instead, they bang at the doors of where we are now, trying to still operate in these old ways, which becomes repulsive to healthy development. So we can see again how these old um, mindsets that really worked in, say, 5,000 years ago begin to become really harmful when the goal is freedom, when the goal is that every human being should be free, when the goal is that maybe we all don't have the same qualities, the same characteristics, the same kind of intelligences, but we all have the ability to accept Christ within us and within our own means glorify ourselves, which is all that matters. Every single person alive today, no matter where you come from, can accept into your heart the Holy Spirit and Christ and glorify yourself from exactly where you are. Nothing else matters. Where somebody else is doesn't matter. Where somebody else was doesn't matter. Where you were, none of that matters. What matters is in this moment, you can completely take responsibility for your life, step into self awareness, and glorify yourself through Christ, through your own inner work. That's everybody's task from wherever they are. So blinders on, it doesn't matter where anybody else is, because it literally doesn't affect your ability to glorify your spiritual bodies and become eternal. Your eternality has nothing to do with someone else's, except for we're all here right now trying to achieve that from where we do stand. So the ideologies are of an individuated person that's spiritually connected, and somebody who is not individuated, not self-conscious, is the battle between dark and light. It was appropriate then, but it's not appropriate now, and it is repulsive to people who are self-aware. Okay. So, in the pre-Christ, pre-incarnation period, angels were perceived differently than in the post-Christ era. The personal angel was not considered, and instead, humanity operated from a tribal condition, and there was an angel that guided the entire group. There was the angel of a clan, or the angel of a family, the angel of a tribe, the angel of a city, nation, or culture. Then, as humanity began to individuate from its initial communal consciousness, the personal angel or the guardian angel began to appear to them. So, this is actually a matter of the more someone individuates, and then not only individuates actually, but as an individual begins to unite their will with God's will. So, the problem is people become kind of pathological when they can't unite their will with God's will. So, as an individual, we stand to fully realize God and know God, right? So that's the key there, because we can only truly know that through our own self and understanding our experiences and our life in that image, with that, with Him as our core, as our spine, as our center. So we don't even begin to like perceive our guardian angel or a personal angel until we become an individual. So that begins to slowly emerge around the time of the Greek era. Okay, that's when we begin to perceive. So the fourth great civilization, which is like the Greek Roman era, that's when humanity begins to really individuate. And that's actually where we get the idea of freedom as well. The first inklings and sparks of freedom, in which America is sort of loosely based on, creating that environment of freedom so that the individual can have free will, mirroring God, and then evolve according to natural law, which is what every human being deserves and is necessary for our evolution. So we get the appearance of the guardian angel and the personal angel when we ourselves individuate from the group. People who are not individuated from the group and they're still at a place of like group thinking, group consciousness, they may not be able to fully grasp the science of the spiritual hierarchies and the personal angel, because they don't yet see themselves actually as an individual. They may know they are because people tell them that all the time, and they can read different spiritual texts that tell them that. So intellectually, they may know that they're an individual on a thought level, but that individualism is not yet embodied and they don't act like they are. So the idea of individuality in the divine sense is not integrated into the body. It's not integrated into the human being. They're not acting that way. It's just a concept to them. Well, having something as a concept doesn't mean that you've mastered it, right? So a lot of people can know about individuation and becoming self-conscious and self-aware, but they're not actually doing it, right? And so this is another interesting thing about when spiritual concepts are integrated and people are acting that way, and when they're not integrated, but they're parroted as a concept, right? So as humanity began to individuate from its initial communal consciousness, the personal angel began to appear to them. Here, nearing the incarnation of Christ, and after the teaching of the personal angel, slowly replaces the worshiping of the collective angel of the tribe of humanity. So over time, especially you can see this in the West, which receives the impulse of individuation very strongly, for good or for ugly. You see this emergence of the personal angel, and you see individuality take root. And then you see the culture, especially of the West, move away from the idea of the collective angel. and the tribal angel, but then you see some of the Eastern traditions retain that concept more because the height of those civilizations was during that period. And so they retain that mystery, and their texts represent that mystery more so than in the West. And again, I want to be very clear, like the East and the West, they're not in competition with each other, right? Just like the where we are now is not in competition with humanity in another 1,000 years. These are just different stages of development in which evolve over time over the world. They're not in competition with one another in actuality, because they're appropriate for the stage of consciousness we're in, and no stage of consciousness is better or worse or competing with another one. It's just because you can have people in the East that are highly developed individuals that are self-aware, right? And you can have people in the West that are completely tribal and not individuated at all. So we're not looking at the people and saying the race of people or this area of people is only this way. We're looking at what came about in that culture, that civilization at the time, and what its gift was. And then looking at how this impulse moves through the world, okay, through the idea of the folk soul or the archangel. Okay. So humanity had the idea of like gods, like a pantheon of gods initially. Every god having a different quality, and every quality could be related to the planetary spheres, right? And humanity was exploring all of these different qualities. And then over time, we move away from this more pluralistic kind of pagan style view of all the gods into the idea of one God. We get monotheism, which is really coming to prepare for humanity to receive the Christ, which is the great solar being here, meaning the second person in the Trinity. But cosmologically, this is the solar logos, so the great solar being. That's how earlier peoples would have seen it to their clairvoyance. It's not evil to see it that way. These are not in competition. The idea of the solar logos doesn't compete with Christ. The idea of these ideas are not in competition with one another. This is an evolution of consciousness over time, right? So we can't understand ourselves if we don't see this evolution. So we have this pantheon of gods, right? Like look at the earlier periods where they had all of these incredible deities that had different qualities, often embodying our relationship with a certain planetary sphere, not aliens, but that the planetary sphere was a certain realm of heaven, a certain development of heaven itself, and we're integrating the qualities of that plane into us. And so we would create an image of a deity that represented that. This is our relationship with the folk spirit, with the angels. That's how we did that. And there was an entire pluralistic world in which we perceived it. And then eventually, around the time of the Egypto-Chaldeans, moved a third, fourth great civilization, which goes Egypt and then Greece. That's when we start to begin to get into that monotheistic concept, because our consciousness is being prepared by the hierarchies to understand the Christ. The Christ is now going to incarnate in a man, into Jesus, and going to perform a significant deed in the world that is going to create the turning point in time in which we spiritualize through being an individual into a higher and higher condition called the resurrection body, the immortal body, or eternality. That's the evolution of the world. But our perception, we can see that changes from this pluralistic image that qualifies the pagan period to a more individualistic period, which qualifies our era. Okay. So here now, as an individual, man stands clearly with his angel and is tasked to move forward spiritually, not as a member of a collective, not as part of a hive mind or a tribe, but rather as an individual. Look, you have to figure out what you really think about things, and you have to act upon what you think. You have to figure out what your intuition says about this person or about that, or what this situation is. You have to act upon that intuition, not what your teacher says, not what your family says, not what your group says, not what people you admire say, but what you think. You have to do that calculation yourself with everything that you know and everything that you feel. That is the task. Any reverting to a group to tell you what to do is a failure in conscience, is a failure in your development. Can you take in the information provided by certain people, by your family, by your friends, by politicians, by Hollywood, by whoever? Certainly, you should educate yourself with as much information and perspective as possible. That's wonderful. But you do not impulsively just believe it like you're a goldfish going with the flow of water. You have to decide what you really think and what you really feel based on the development of your own mind and your ability to think critically, and then what your spirit and your angel is telling you. You must combine these two things. That is when consciousness soul really enlivens. That's the beginning of manas, which is our next stage of development, the development where the angels are now, that we'll reach in our Jupiter condition to get into Anthroposophy. This is what we must do. This is your task. This can be broken down into practical guidance. Okay. You have to make your own decisions and act on them. If it ends out bad for you, if you feel like you made the wrong decision, good. At least you made a decision. Okay. Now you can learn. Now you can build. Now you can develop. And I promise you, the most pain you will have in your life is not making the wrong decision. It is making no decision at all and allowing somebody else to make it for you. That will be the greatest pain in your life because you didn't even take responsibility for that moment. Being wrong is not the greatest pain. Following the tribe and then being hurt because you didn't even become active in a decision, that is the greatest pain for the human being. That is what hurts. So keep this in mind. So now we are tasked to move through life according to our own volition, developing our own mind and spiritual centers, living according to our own calculations, discoveries, and personal attunement. Here we meet not only ourselves, God who lives within us. It is only through this process that we can truly understand God within us. That's why it's hard. It's because the benefit is so great. And yes, it takes courage, but this is the development of your soul, right? So, understanding heaven and earth, you have to understand heaven and earth directly through your experiences, your critical thinking, and your calculations, no longer depending on the group. That's the task at hand, everyone. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into humanity pre-incarnation of Christ, and how we saw the angels. So before the incarnation of Christ, we really sort of saw ourselves as like part of nature, and we were embedded in the natural world as kind of almost like an automatic machine like thing, more so. And we saw the angels and the archangels everywhere around us. We could see the angels embedded in nature, and there really wasn't a separation at all. And it's only when man becomes an individual that we begin to lose our clairvoyance. So the catch is that the more individuated we become, which is necessary for our glorification, the more we lose our spiritual vision, the more we lose that connection to the spiritual plane. Now, in anthroposophy, this is called the loss of the atavistic clairvoyance or the lunar clairvoyance, which is that the most natural kind of spiritual perception to the human being is actually completely and totally inappropriate for this time. And we actually have to consciously develop out of this atavistic clairvoyance eventually, just like we have to develop out of the hive mind into an individual. So the same thing is true for spiritual perception, which is why the spiritual field is so chaotic and so crazy, is because there's different streams of spiritual perception according to your attunement. And when the Bible talks about in Leviticus and the other passage, when the Bible talks about not going to see mediums and things like that, it's talking about people that are working from this atavistic, ancient, pagan kind of spirituality, which was becoming more and more overtaken by delusion. It wasn't a statement about never being able to perceive the spiritual world, never being able to interact with angels, never being able to interact or see your deceased relative or a saint. That's ridiculous. When people start to take, especially in Christianity, and say no one can be a medium, this is the snake devouring its own tail. This is a kind of spiritual perspective that will destroy the religion itself, because the whole point in human development is literally to regain clairvoyance through attunement to Christ and the Holy Spirit, and have that special clairvoyance that is embodied and objective through you and no longer through the group, which is a different spiritual perception that involves embodiment versus disassociation. Okay, this is a conversation of attunement. So in the earlier period, we had what is called atavistic clairvoyance or atavistic psychic abilities. And we could see all the spiritual being around us, all the spiritual world, but we could not experience ourselves as individuals while doing that. And that's why we see in our culture so many different kinds of spiritual ceremonies that are directly creating that atavistic experience through creating disassociation. So you have like plant medicine ceremonies, you have MK Ultra, LSD, you have all kinds of different techniques that involve getting up out of the body rather than being embodied, creating frenzy, creating disassociation, shooting, creating an altered state of consciousness in order to be with the spiritual world, when actually real clairvoyance, real spiritual ability doesn't require any of that. That's actually considered dangerous. And what you need is to do it from exactly where you are in your waking life. So there is no disassociation. There is no, you know, getting out of your body in that sense. It doesn't mean I'm not talking about astral travel. I'm talking about actually having to create a frenzy through orgy, through drugs, through these old, sort of very old traditions in which that's what people would do in order to have a spiritual experience. Well, now we need to be able to do that completely embodied through ourself as a natural state. So we are kind of between this old atavistic clairvoyance, which is ancient and part of an earlier vestige of humanity, with real clairvoyance, which comes from total attunement and being fully conscious and not disassociated or high at all, right? So this is one of the differences between atavistic and real clairvoyance. I will get into that later. But this is also why when people that are tapped into this old atavistic stream, they have like really weird explanations of things and really weird interpretations of spiritual beings and stuff because they're not in the right position to view the spiritual world for our time, and they're getting all this weird stuff going on, which isn't actually, which is delusional, and we have to be very careful about that. So and the interesting thing, I think I said this in another talk about angels, was that when the Bible was written, and of course all the texts before the Bible, humanity knew what angels were and talked about them all the time. And it was the way in which they interacted with the spiritual world was through the spiritual hierarchies. It was completely and totally known. There was no need to describe in the Bible what an angel was. That would be ridiculous. It would be like trying to describe to someone what a tomato is who works at an Italian restaurant. They were working with that assumed knowledge, but now we no longer have that assumed knowledge of what angels are. So we're creating all these weird cosmologies and definitions because we don't have that assumed knowledge, because we've come so deeply into the individualistic perspective that we no longer have that kind of clairvoyance anymore. So angels appeared around us in nature. They were seen as the force behind weather events in the East. They were called devas, and they would be around certain areas, guarding certain areas. They would connect with certain devas, certain kinds of archangels to absorb their qualities as part of their soul's development. And angels could also work through animals. So when you look at the animism of the Native American people and how they had totem poles, which were like the image of their tribe's spiritual life, you're not really looking at a people that worshipped animals or trees or nature in the physical sense. It's very irritating when you see people studying shamanism and stuff, and they think that the Native American people were like literally worshiping a tree or a bear. No, they're worshiping they're worshiping the angels and spiritual beings that appeared to them through an animal, through nature. So they saw the spiritual beings very classically as working in nature, through animals, through the sky, through the earth, through the trees, through the plants. And every kingdom of life had a different quality and a different angel behind it. So they were actually connecting with the spiritual hierarchies like every other tradition, but they saw the spiritual hierarchies as appearing to them and communicating to them through nature. Okay, so that's that. And again, there were certain angels that were associated with the sky and the planets and the stars. These aren't aliens. The sky people aren't aliens. They're angels that were associated with the air, with the sky. And there were also angels that were associated with the earth, with water. And so when their people are earth worshippers, they're worshiping the spiritual hierarchies. They're worshiping God as it appeared to them through the spiritual hierarchies, which were nature itself. And through that, they were learning about their own patterns, their own harmony, their own relationship with God in a very easy way, which was through nature, because the patterns in nature are mirrored in the human being. So that's how we did it in that earlier period before we were individuals. We needed to know all of this. We had to build ourselves up through this kind of spiritual life for thousands and thousands of years to be able to even understand the great Christ, to be able to understand God as a monotheistic concept. You don't just come to that conclusion. A people and planet has to be built up for thousands and thousands and thousands of years over several epochs to begin to receive the Christ, to begin to understand that singular idea. So we have to keep that in mind. And angels would also work through people. They would unite with an individual sometimes. They didn't have the idea of like the personal angel, but they knew that like the chief or the king or the priest king would or the shaman sometimes would actually have his spiritual body united with a powerful angel or archangel, and that would be working through him, and that's what would give him the ability to govern. So in our age we think of like like politics is such a mess. Like it's like whoever makes the most promises to the lobbyists, that's who gets elected. That's who gets to rule the world. Completely inverted and dark. Originally, um, in order to rule, in order to be a king, in order to be a priest king, you would have to be able to attune yourself to and bring forward, a solar angel, a higher angel, and that would work through you. So it wasn't even about you. You were a vehicle. The same thing with the high priestess. High priestess wasn't that way because of some of her own mind. It was somebody who could bring forward a spiritual being greater than themselves, an angel greater than themselves, could be a vessel for that. So this is how we worked with angels and viewed angels. So going a little bit deeper, you could also see the group angel, the archangel, because remember in earlier times, people didn't see the personal angel, they saw the group. They had an angel for an entire group. So if you had like a clan, they would have a specific culture and name and kind of language, and then they would have an angel that guided that was the responsible for that, those impulses developing on the earth. So for that reason, sometimes if you look at different traditions, they'll describe the archangels in a certain way, like a tutelary deity. Okay, so you have this idea of like this, the angel of the tribe, the angel of the family, the angel of the city, nation, or region. Another word for it in modern esotericism would be again folk spirit, like Rudolf Steiner described the archangels as folk spirits. Um, yeah, it's not, I haven't written it here, but the archangels would be archangels, spirits of fire, archangeloi, or folk spirit. And he has a lecture actually that goes into um, the role of the angels on the earth called, I think it's the mission of the folk spirit. I think it is. And that's a very powerful lecture series, especially just to get that clarity on the hierarchies and how we relate to them. Um, and that will also create a kind of structure within your own being that is clarifying as well. Because the organization of the cosmos is the organization of the self. So when you can conceptualize the relationship of humanity with the angels and archangels and spiritual hierarchies, you can now automatically begin to conceptualize your own inner world and your own evolution. That's why this topic is so important. So in the East, the closest thing would be like a Dhyani Kohan. And this is using like the theosophical descriptions. So the closest thing in like esoteric Hinduism and the Eastern mysteries would be the idea of a Dhyani Kohan, or um, I think in Taoism or Tibetan Buddhism, the idea of the immortals. Um, so the concept exists in every tradition, just using a little bit of different language, and they may approach it from a different perspective because they're in a different perspective. So just because something's talked about in a little bit of a different way or has a different name does not mean that that civilization did not look at the same great heavens that we did. Another mistake that I think certain conversations can certain conversations can make in modern times is to think that all the past traditions are like not valid when they're looking upon the same heavens, the same spiritual truths, the same objective spiritual world and beings we are, they're just interacting with them from a different place within themselves that was appropriate for that time. And they're interacting with them from a different consciousness, a different kind of perspective than we are. And in a sense, the loss of that perspective has caused a lot of mourning in the human being, right? It's kind of this more magical perspective that the further we go back, we're more integrated with the spiritual life, and then we kind of fall away from it in the second fall, and then we have to build it back, right? So every phase has its beauty, and we cannot understand the future civilizations of humanity without seeing the past as being beautiful as well and an integral part of where we are. And we can't judge like any any tradition by its darkest hour. So yes, if we look at paganism, we can see that the dark era of paganism brought about human sacrifice and some of the worst dark occult practices that we are looking at today. But that's not the entirety of what that phase was. That's the dark side of it. And there's a dark side to every single era. Okay. So basically, you could say an archangel or a folk spirit rules an entire group of people. Now, it's really difficult to understand this now on our time because we're all so integrated with one another. But even like 500 years ago, the different civilizations had clearly different qualities, different languages, like people spoke a different language. And we had to learn that about each other. We had to learn about each other's different orientations and qualities and things like that because the folk spirit was isolated to these different regions. So nowadays, there's much more traversing of the world. And so we're we're not it's a little bit harder to I think to understand the folk spirit because we're all kind of coming under the solar spirit now. But in earlier times, uh you could much easier in a much easier way see the folk spirit, see the archangel that was ruling these different regions of peoples by their language, by their temperament, by what they value, their gifts, things like that. You could see that the folk spirit was working in a certain way in these different people. Um, and Rudolf Steiner really highlights language, that one of the ways in which the folk spirit can really be seen um, before the world opens up and we begin to interact with one another is in language. So when you look at the different language patterns and the different languages, that was really you could see the delineation of the folk spirit through language, through dialect. So when a people, so a group of people would be underneath an archangel or a folk spirit, they would be directly influenced by that archangel and they would be receiving impulses from it and developing its qualities. They'd be living in like simpatico with it, developing and expressing that particular angel's qualities, if that makes sense. So let's read what Rudolf Steiner actually says about the archangel or the folk spirit. There he is. Archangels are leaders of whole peoples. What one calls the folk spirit, the common spirit of the people or folk, is really one of the archangels. You will now find it comprehensible that these people who were still conscious of such a spiritual connection did not look up direct to the highest being, but that they turned their gaze to the beings nearest to them, who directed and led them. This is GA 102, Lecture 7. So he's talking about humanity being at a phase in which they looked up to the closest being to them rather than at the face of the Godhead itself, right? This is something we have to understand about the spiritual hierarchies, is that sometimes people will say, well, why are you talking about angels? Like, you're doing idol worship, or there's no need to get so into angels. You just need to understand Jesus. You just need to understand Christ. And it's like, actually, no, we need to pursue the truth, which is Christ, but the reality that Christ, the Father, the Godhead, the Trinity, works through the hierarchies, because that being is too big for us to comprehend. So if you look at this image again, nothing about understanding the spiritual hierarchies negates the Father, negates Christ, negates the Holy Spirit. In fact, it leads to it. If you follow man upward through angels, archangels, archai, powers, mights, dominions, thrones, cherubim, cherubim, you arrive at the Trinity. You arrive at the Godhead. So how can these beings, how can the angels deter from the Godhead, deter from the Christ, when they are literally leading humanity to the Christ every day through their activity, and are the reason why we even have a conception of the Christ to begin with, because they preserved that concept and radiated it down to us. And when we understand the life of Jesus, we will understand the hierarchies and how the Christ comes into incarnation. We cannot actually understand the incarnation of Christ unless we understand how Christ moves down the hierarchies to man in his descent into the world. So the idea of angels does not take away the from the teachings of like Jesus or something. Like, this is not the reality. The reality is we actually understand the Christ more and God more through the hierarchies. And it's our loss of this knowledge that's causing all of these problems in perception, actually, because it's like a gap that's missing, and people keep trying to fill in the gap of the hierarchies with different weird things, with like ideas of technology, with aliens, with weird ideologies that don't lead to your evolution at all. So that was Rudolf Steiner on the archangels. Archangels are the leaders of whole peoples. What one calls the folk spirit, the common spirit of the people or folk, is in reality one of the archangels. You will find it comprehensible. You will now find it comprehensible that those peoples who were still conscious of such spiritual connection did not look up to the direct highest being. They didn't look up to Godhead. They couldn't perceive it. We still have difficulty perceiving it. But that they turned their gaze to the beings nearest to them, the beings of the hierarchies who directed and led them, particularly the folk spirit or the archangels. And also, Aquinas also wrote about a lot of the earlier church fathers and church figures in Christianity, who were obviously at that phase of individuation and were very brilliant. They would talk about like the angel rule, the particular angel that was ruling ancient Persia. I think Aquinas talked about the angel ruling Persia. You look back into these different dialects and discords where they're like, these incredible mystics, Christian mystics in particular, are talking about how there's an angel that's ruling this particular region, this particular people, this particular city. And we no longer have that perception anymore. But we did even maybe like 1,000 years ago, but we've lost it. Okay, so let's get into some examples of the folk spirit, the guardian angel, what would be called a tutelary deity, what would be called a um maybe a kohan, okay? Okay, so an example of a archangel would be if you remember, like, if you go back to, like, say, Rome or Greece, they would have like a regent that ruled the city. So there was like a patron god or a patron goddess. So, for example, Athena ruled Athens, right? Apollo, the sun god, the sun angel, which would be like Archangel Michael, ruled Delphi. Amun ruled Thebes, and Marduk ruled Babylon. So you have this idea of like this spiritual being, this angel, this archangel that would be ruling an entire region, an entire city often. So let's take a look at at an image of this. So there we have on the left, you have Athena. So these would have been all over Athens, and Athens would have been a city that was working with the angel that Athena represented. So now we have to get a little bit deeper into how humanity perceived angels at the time. So humanity didn't perceive an angel as it was. Okay. Humanity wasn't looking into the spiritual world and laying their eyes upon an angel as it really exists. Angels appear to us symbolically. We won't see an angel as it really is until we get much further on in our spiritual development, right? We're only at basic self-awareness now. So, how we would perceive an angel would be we would perceive an image of our qualities and heavenly qualities mixed with the angel. So we would see the angel as a representation of ourselves and the qualities that we're looking to integrate or that we're working on. So we would see angels in a symbolic form. They often appeared as winged because one of the things that happens when you're clairvoyant and you begin to actually see angels is they fly around. They actually literally are like a person zooming through the room. Sometimes it appears as an orb or a ball, but then as your clairvoyance increases, it literally looks like a person. Like sometimes I'll see it as like a head and shoulders in like a white robe that just like zips through the room. Sometimes they're walking, but um they were perceiving the angel as an image of their qualities of themselves. So sometimes they're winged because when you see an angel, they're not physical, so they're literally zooming around. So their way of showing that was with bird wings because they understood that birds fly, that insects fly, that these flying things would be represented as an angel. So it's not representing the gods that came from space in a spaceship. It's literally representing the reality that when you see an angel, it's often flying through the air because it's not in a physical form. So they would portray it with wings. Very simple, right? And so you have here with Athena, you're not looking at an angel, you're looking at a human construct of what would appear when they would be working with the angel. So qualities within themselves that they're working on that would appear when they're in communion with their archangel. Okay, so they were working on the qualities that Athena represents. Athena isn't an angel. Athena's representing the relationship between humanity and the angels as an archetypal figure. The same thing with Marduk here in the middle. This isn't a picture of an angel. This is a representation of humanity and its consciousness. When they would work with the angels, they created a composite of themselves and the archangel to represent their communication with it, to represent the principles and what they were representing, the images that would come to them based on their triangulation with an angel. They're triangulating themselves with an angel. And these are the images that emerged, which say more about humanity and its development at that time and their perception than it does about the angel, right? So we're getting images not of the angel directly, but of the human perception of the angel based on who they are at the time. So it's a composite, it's a representation, it's a human angelic archetype. Here we have Apollo. Apollo is the essence that emerges through the image of also Archangel Michael. So any kind of solar deity, you're getting into the solar angels. Any kind of lunar deity, you're getting into the relationship with the lunar angel, with Gabriel. Okay. Any kind of entity, it's the triangulation, the distillation of your relationship with that particular archangel. Okay, which can be associated with the planetary sphere, which is why you also have the gods always associated with the planets, right? A heavenly body, whether it be a Ceres or Minerva or Aphrodite and Venus and Apollo and the sun, the different lunar goddesses like Selene. All of these are also the communication with the archangel. Okay, so we're creating these composites of ourselves, of our where we are, um, as we communicate and triangulate with the angel. We're creating these images that really represent our communication with them. Okay, so Marduk was the god of Babylon, the image of the archangel of Babylon, and Apollo was the solar archangel of Delphi. You also had Tanit of Carthage. Now, people look at that, obviously, like look at the center image. They look at that and they think, whoa, that looks demonic. That looks demonic because that is a chimerical shape, or that looks like an alien. Not really, not really. Again, this is a composite of the qualities that they clairvoyantly saw emerge when they were in communion with their angel. These were qualities that they were developing within themselves. And as I talked about with the Native American traditions, people saw the angels working through nature. So they would work through the animal kingdom. They would work through animals. They would work through weather. They would work through plants. They saw the natural world as being completely mitigated by angels. And so they saw that the animals had certain qualities. And so when they made an animal person, this chimerical anthropomorphic figure, they're showing the qualities of that animal, the spiritual qualities of that animal are taking a precedent in their worship, or there's a certain quality that's coming forward through that animal. They're not talking about like there isn't like a cat alien being that was walking around in a dress with a dagger. Okay, that's not what that image represents. It's a composite image created that represents different qualities represented. The further you go back often by animals, but it's not the animal, it's the spiritual quality of the animal which they understood. It's very similar to the totem pole of the Haida culture or the animism of the earlier Native American people. They weren't worshiping the animal, they're worshiping the spiritual qualities of the animal, which was an emergence of the angels in the world. Okay, does that make sense? You also have a moon who represented Thebes. But I want to say though, where the dark side comes in, it's not so much it's not so much like you see Baphomet or you see Tanit or you see these deities that have animal properties. It's not so much that they have an animal property, it's that human beings have evolved so far from that particular kind of worship that the entities that now work through those rites and customs are no longer the same ones that were there to begin with, because these older traditions enter into a death spiral where the angels don't work through the same idols all the time, because human consciousness evolves and humanity must create more and more accurate representations of the spiritual world as we evolve. And so what happens is the older the tradition gets, the easier sometimes it is for these darker forces to take over the images because it's so far from where humanity is now. So it's not actually because it's like an animal figure, it's more so that we don't view things like that anymore. We view things as more human, except for there are some demonic figures that will genuinely appear like that. And why that happens is it represents the descent of the human being into an animalistic quality. So also why you get a demonic association with like animal chimerical humans, and it shouldn't be confused with the actual gods, is that when the human or angel condition regresses into an animal condition, that's seen as a degeneration, that's seen as a regression, that's seen as a kind of fall, which indicates that there could be something dark going on. So usually demonic entities and stuff will appear with these animal parts because it's showing that they're regressed. They can't contain the divine human form, which represents God, which is an embodiment and a microcosm of the macrocosm. So sometimes also when you see these animal qualities, they do appear on demonic entities because it represents the regression into the animal instincts, into the basal instincts, right? So there's different reasons why you get these animal human anthropomorphic images. And that's why they often appear demonic. I hope that makes sense. This is a complex topic, but that's the best I can do in 10 minutes. Okay, so the next entity we have here is Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli. And he was the angel of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan. Those Aztec words really are hard to pronounce. So he is the representation there on the right of how the people of that region conveyed their angel, their archangel, as a mixture of these different qualities. That was a mixture of their own appearance, their own art, their own activity that was being inspired through the angel. So these are composite images that humanity is creating to represent a mixture of the qualities of themselves and the earth and their angel, their archangel, the angel of their tribe. And again, these are not images of the personal angel of the individual. These are images of the archangel. Okay? The archangel of different peoples. And that's why they have the distinct planetary associations. So in all of these images, you have the quality of the archetypal quality of the angel is shown. And that is what is appropriate for that culture at that time according to its development. And again, yeah, some of these things look a little scary because we're no longer in that condition, right? And the archangel would sort of, they would see their folk spirit, their angel, as their guardian, their archangel, as granting them certain powers and guiding their behavior, inspiring them. And they also believe that the archangel of their group would kind of withdraw if taboos were broken and humanity acted immorally. So when you start to get into how humanity operated in these earlier periods, they did believe that they had to sort of operate with a certain code of ethics. And if the taboos of their culture were broken, they believed that their tribal angel would retreat and to punish them. So this is sort of where you get into these different ideas of sacrifice and offerings and these unusual cultural activities that are typical for a tribal culture, with the tribal angel belief, is that they felt like they had to do all of these sacrifices or offerings in order to reattune to their angel. They believed that they displeased their god displeased their folk spirit, their tribal angel, their tribal archangel, and they had to kind of get back into its good graces. And over time, they began to believe that human sacrifice would do that, that certain offerings would do that. But that was in the decadent period, because really what would do that would just be personal attunement. But over time, as things got darker and darker and sort of more fallen angels moved into that stead, it began to distort. So again, the image of these beings is a distillation, okay? It's a distillation or image of the people and the deity mixed together, a representation of their relationship with the angel, okay? So the archangel is portrayed as a hybrid image of the angel and its culture and the people. That's why it all looks so different, is because they're forming that image based on their own image and the angel and what comes about as a creative expression of their relationship with the angel and as they're learning about themselves. All right, you guys, let's just take a little break here. And I want to tell you to don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps me out here. Also, I have a class coming out shortly, which is called Your Guardian Angel and Spirit Guides. And it is a 6-week long class. And I'm going to be teaching about your relationship with your guardian angel. We're going to talk a little bit about mediumship. We're going to talk about attunement. There's going to be all kinds of everything that I think you'd want to know about your angel, and spirit guides and all of that. And you can sign up. There should be a pinned comment in the chat right now. And you can also sign up to be notified in the description below. And if you're watching this on the replay and it's already been a few months, that class will probably already be available for you to just take part in. It won't be live, but it'll be there anyway. It's the same information. So that helps me be able to continue to do free lectures and all of this stuff here. I'm totally supported by my audience. So if you want to become a premium member, you can go ahead and do that. I do live Q&As, and I do exclusive content over there. I have a course over there that's free for members on the 4 bodies, and I have the spirit guide lecture. And so there's going to be more exclusive content there that won't appear here as well. I have hundreds of hours of live Q&As covering like every topic you could imagine too. So so consider signing up. Okay. So that was early humanity. Early humanity really saw themselves as one with nature, one with the cycles of nature. And they operated as kind of like a clan or a tribe in communion with their folk spirit, with their archangel. And they didn't perceive the individual angel yet. They just operated in this kind of collective underneath the archangel. And that's how humanity operated for a very long time. And there's even talk about this being the central theme in Atlantis when Rudolf Steiner talks about the planetary oracles and how the different cultures were surrounding the different planetary spheres. That's just parallel to the different archangels as well, because they're associated with the different planetary realms. So we operated in that way for a long time, a long, long, long time. But once we get into our current epoch, which is called the post-Atlantean epoch in the anthroposophical system, we start getting into the great fourth civilization. So in the post-Atlantean era, which means the time after the antediluvians, the time after the Atlantean fall, we come into these great civilizations. We come into the great Indian civilization, which reigns for a period of time. Then you come into the Persian civilization. Then you come into the third civilization, which is the Egypto-Chaldean, Assyrian, Babylonian civilization. That reigns. And then so a lot of that is the East, the Middle East. And then you get into the fourth great civilization, which is the Greco-Roman culture. There you get the incarnation of Christ and the turning point in time. So by the time we get to this fourth civilization, which is period around the incarnation of Christ, the time of the Greeks, Romans, this is where you begin to see the personal angel emerge. So before that time, it was very much the way we were just describing it. You literally had tutelary spirits that would rule the city, that would rule a clan, that would rule a tribe, and nobody saw. I mean, I'm sure there were some people that were aware there was a personal angel, but you would be in the minority. If you were aware of your guardian angel and engaging in that process, you would be like way ahead of the average person. So eventually, we get to the time where now we're going to get the incarnation. Now God is going to incarnate into a human being, into man. And that's going to create what Rudolf Steiner calls the turning point in time, going from a completely externalized hive mind style situation to an internalized people that can now spiritualize themselves out of matter, out of physical life. It's a totally different environment after the incarnation. So as we near that, you start to get the culture of the great philosophers. You get Plato, you get Plutarch, you get this kind of Hellenistic or Hermetic, Platonic culture. You even get the Pythagorean schools that come out of Greece and affect Rome. And this is right at the point where humanity is starting to individuate. We've had thousands of years of being a tribal people, and then now in this Greek culture, we're starting to come out of that. We're getting these different political ideas about freedom, the Senate. We're getting all this kind of stuff that really will eventually evolve in our time to want to make all natural laws official, to protect the freedom of humanity, and to allow this evolution of the spirit to continue, which is the true vision of America. Okay, so we're at this point in the fourth great civilization or the Greek culture where we're starting to see these conversations emerge, especially with Plato, where there is the idea of the personal daemon. There is the idea of the personal genius. And so Plato starts to speak about really the person, what we would consider the personal guardian angel is what Plato called his daimon or his genius, right? So we're starting to see that, and with that comes this incredible development of the mind, this culture of contemplation, and this is really particular to that period because the ability to perceive your angel comes with this ability to individuate, but to really individuate, it takes what? Contemplation. You have to be able to think. You have to be able to think critically. You can't be just thinking as though you're part of the tribe. You actually have to be able to contemplate. So we get the great philosophers. The great philosophers were incredibly spiritual people that were bringing the mind to spirit, that were engaging in consciousness, soul. They were engaging in self-consciousness because the moment you become self-conscious and self-aware, that means that you can think. People who are not self-aware cannot think. They don't think. They wait for somebody else to tell them what to do. They go along with the family, with the culture, with the politicians, with whatever it is. They don't think. Thinking is the quality that a self-aware person has. And we can very clearly see that today. There's a lot of people that go along with some really bad things that are pretty obvious to some because they're not thinking. They're literally just impulsively acting. right? They're acting from impulse. So what characterizes this era of becoming aware of the guardian angel, finally the personal angel, is really in this Platonic era where Plato starts to talk about the daimon and the personal genius that he has, and building the mind to spirit, because angels are also associated with manas, or the spirit self, which is the activity of contemplation. And in this earlier period, especially Thomas Aquinas, he associated the angel with the birth of intellectualism, that you couldn't actually perceive or have a relationship with your angel or the spiritual world truly as a person, unless you were using your mind. So the way into the angel is through developing your mind, through contemplation, through understanding philosophy, through understanding cosmology, through understanding the human condition. And not only understanding it, but understanding it particularly through a moral lens. Real philosophy brings the human being to spirit through morality, and includes morality in all of its contemplations. Okay, this is important. So Plato begins to speak of his daimon, and his daemon, which is really the personal angel, is part of how he gets creativity, his divine influence, how he gets his genius. It doesn't come from him. It comes from a spiritual being that is united with him, that really forms the mind. The mind actually isn't the brain. I hate to break it to you. The mind is not the brain. The mind is outside of the body and is a process in which you are united and working through your angel. And obviously, the Greeks knew this. The early church fathers knew this as well. So, through your daimon, you would experience creativity and inspiration, and you would be building up your soul to heaven through its influence. So through your angel, you would contemplate, you'd be inspired, you'd be creative, and through your interaction with your angel or your daimon or your genius, you would build yourself up to heaven. You would build your immortal body. You would get to the condition maybe eventually of manas in the next earthly cycle. Okay? So here is Plato, and he says, "My daemon has the habit of opposing me each and every time, even about minor things, if I was not going to do anything not correctly." So here, Plato is saying that darn daemon, my angel is always encouraging me to be moral. My angel's always encouraging me to do the right thing. On every little small habit, my angel, my personal angel, my guardian angel, my daemon is guiding me into higher conditions. And Plutarch carries on this tradition, talking about the daemon and the angel, and even begin to talk more closely about the entire angelic hierarchy. So the conversation moves from discussing the planetary angels and the archangels, from discussing the angels, the hierarchy just above man. So this happens with the individuation of the human being. And again, a big part of this was morality, and then the mind had to be linked to spirit through contemplation. So this is one of my beefs with I think the New Age as well, is especially with my occulted episodes. A good example of this is that people will just say, well, I don't want to hear about what the black magicians are doing. Thank you very much. I don't really care. I'm just going to radiate peace into the world, and that's that. It doesn't matter. We don't need to understand it. We don't need to contemplate it. That's called spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing happens when people refuse to engage in contemplation. They refuse to actually become involved in these ideas out of fear, feeling like they're not ready, feeling like they can't sit with negative emotion, feeling like they're not able, feeling like the moment they sit with something that feels challenging, that they'll be destroyed. Right? So we have to understand that at our point in development, how we grow is through bringing our mind to spirit, which means we must understand and we must be able to contemplate all of these things from a place of calmness, understanding that we are moving towards our eternity, our eternality, and that to just try to be ignorant of different concepts and just try to like radiate positivity is an atavistic quality. Before human beings had the ability to really develop mind, that's a pre-mind impulse. It's an impulse that's atavistic, that is based in an earlier phase of humanity when humanity didn't have the ability to think. All we could do was like radiate different energies and have them radiated back to us. And so if we could create the right essence within us, we'd get it back. We didn't have the organ of mind, so we didn't have to use it. So there's this weird spiritual bypassing that goes on where people still think they can just, you know, create positive emotions and that'll be enough. No, we have to understand the situation that we're in. We have to contemplate it. We have to understand it with our mind. We have to make decisions based on what we understand. We have to confront evil. We have to understand good. These are all things that we have to participate in. And we have to develop our mind. And in the East, again, this is called the development of manas. This is self-mastery, to master these different things in the world, which means to understand them and respond correctly, morally, is to master yourself, which is to glorify yourself. So there's no path forward for any human being if you cannot enter into this consciously, means using your mind, contemplation. And the beginning of this was the great era of the philosophers, the great Platonic era, where we see these ideas of what is a civilization, what is morality, how does the human mind work. All of these things are about actually self-mastery. Self-mastery through understanding cosmos and God. Intellectually, with our mind. We can't just leave the mind out of things, right? We're no longer living in Lemuria, which is like, there's no mind, you know, so we have to understand this. But it's not, and again, I want to say it's not just like mind as in pure intellectualism. It is the mind united with God. So it's your mind and your will united with God's will. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not just pure scientism and intellectualism. When I say mind, I mean the spiritualized mind, the mind connected with God. So man can no longer live through his instinct, through just instinct and feelings and radiating feelings, but man has to use his mind, and his mind has to be linked with God. Okay. And that is spirit self in anthroposophy. When we finally get into doing that and getting good at that and into that region of heaven, that's called spirit self in anthroposophy. And that's where humanity will get into after the earthly condition, basically, which is the realm of the angels. So philosophy's highest purpose was to unite with spirit through the angel by developing our mind and becoming conscious. And the personal daemon was seen as being embedded in the astral body, in the soul. And that's how we would communicate with it. Okay, so we just did the Greek civilization, which was the great Greco-Roman civilization, which was kind of this introduction to the angel and the idea of the personal angel. And where the guardian angel really starts to pick up steam is in Christianity. So Christianity is centered around Christ and the incarnation, the mysteries that now are unfolded before humanity through the incarnation. And so one of those mysteries is the idea of the personal angel. And so finally, in Christianity, you get the teaching of the personal angel because now we're individuated. We have the incarnation. Now we can see ourselves as individuals. Now we can see spiritual beings as individuals. It's not just a folk spirit, an archangel, or an archai, the spirit of the age. Now we're no longer operating from a totally tribal capacity, just as like a hive. We're now individuals. And so we can perceive the individual angel. And the different schisms, like I don't think that evangelicals or Protestants have necessarily the same idea of the guardian angel as Orthodox and Catholicism does. I believe that Orthodoxy and Catholicism um, maintain the teaching of the guardian angel or the personal angel. But I think it was sort of cut back a little bit in Protestantism. I believe, I'm not sure, but from what I understand, that is the case. But you do see it coming forward in Catholicism mainly, and then you also see it in Orthodoxy, the idea of the personal guardian angel. And it's also spoken about in the Bible, the angel, the fact that angels are looking over humanity. That becomes talked about in the Bible a lot, like in Psalm. Okay, so here, okay. For he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. There's many different mentions of angels in the Bible. That's just one. But again, it's saying that the angels are given charge over you. They're given this regency over humanity to develop so that we can develop. And so you see it in classical Christianity, the mentioning of angels all the time. But then you get the idea of the spiritual hierarchies that begins to emerge through the Pauline stream, the Dionysian stream, which you get the celestial hierarchies or the spiritual hierarchies written about in Christianity. So in through Christianity and especially in Christian mysticism, you start to get the emergence of this objective view of the spiritual hierarchies that just did not exist before Christ. Before Christ, it was the experience of the hierarchies as nature through the kingdoms of nature and through um, worldly experience, understanding that angels were behind everything, kind of embedded in the angels. We walked amongst them, sort of thing. And then through Christianity, you sort of get this more objective, scientific, actually, approach to the spiritual world and spiritual life. It becomes more individuated. So you're able to break it down and see the patterns in an objective way. So you get like the spiritual hierarchies or the celestial hierarchies teachings. And you get to see the different classes of angels in their universal qualities, which was only experienced um, in, archetypally in earlier periods. Now we're seeing them objectively. Um, you also get different offshoots like the Rosicrucians who start talking about the holy guardian angel and who have this more esoteric view of Christianity. Now, the holy guardian angel is um, an esoteric wording that was used around the turn of the century, and different occult teachings use it that kind of emerged from the Rosicrucian stream. Like I think Crowley uses that term. Um, And I think OTO uses that term, but that's not an original term from the OTO or from Crowley. They're using a concept that's ancient, um, that emerged much earlier in esoteric Christianity, and the reality that every single person has a guardian angel. And then it's through connecting with your guardian angel that you glorify yourself. So that process is initiation science. The process of your self glorification comes through the resurrection mysteries, comes through initiation science, comes through understanding the hierarchies and the different conditions of consciousness that can be seen very distinctly once you're individuated, but not when you're in a collective state. So you do get people who obviously have access to the idea of glorification and that we have a personal angel, but like that doesn't mean that like they invented the topic. Like Crowley did not invent the topic of the guardian or holy guardian angel. um that that period of time at the turn of the century, the like 1850s to 1950s, was this emerging of a lot of esoteric occult concepts that are really early, really ancient, that existed in different um, books that were being translated finally, and different societies and organizations that were doing different things. And it's sort of like you're getting a lot of classical information that sometimes is being, I would say, taught in ways that is beneath it sometimes. So just because you hear the word holy guardian angel by someone like Crowley, that does not mean that he's, or the OTO or something, has invented the idea of human glorification and the spiritual hierarchy's connection to that. That's just they've attached themselves to an already existing concept and been using it as part of their curriculum. And you also have anthroposophy. Now, the anthroposophical system, which is esoteric Christianity, um, has probably the most comprehensive view of the spiritual hierarchies that I have found. You can see where it interlaces with the Eastern mysteries and the Dhyani Kohans and the Devas and the immortals and all that kind of stuff. But when you get to Rudolf Steiner's teachings and the anthroposophical material around the hierarchies, you're getting a very clear and distinct image of cosmos and the human place in that. And so, in my opinion, the anthroposophical work is the most advanced at this time around the spiritual hierarchies. There's some people that have just noted on it, but as for like a comprehensive explanation, you're going to want to do the spiritual hierarchies lecture series by Steiner. And the mission of the folk soul is also very good. Um, his lecture series on angels are very much ahead of their time. Um, and So I would say there, because in anthroposophy, we do get this deep esoteric Christian perspective of angels, of archangels, of archai, of the entire spiritual hierarchies. And we also get that cosmology, which is really important because um, we learn how to understand creation, right? We understand creation through the hierarchies. We understand the development of not only the earth, but the cosmos itself through the hierarchies. We understand the glorification of the human being into an immortal form in part through the angels, because the bodies that we have are connected to their body. So all of it is really surrounding this idea of the spiritual hierarchies. And there's so many unusual, false stuff around it that will have a detrimental effect. So I really recommend the anthroposophical stream for this. I think he does the best job of this. All right, so here's some more quotes. So when we get into the birth of Christianity and the Christian tradition, it is distinctly different than the pre-Christian traditions because it is centered around humanity becoming an individual. And so while we can say a lot of things about the turning point in time and the crucifixion, there's so much we can say about the resurrection mysteries in general. Um, one of the most important things socially and personally from a practical level is like humanity becomes, human beings are required to now become an individual. And we can now do that because God himself has incarnated in man, giving us that capacity from within to actually go through that process, which was not within us before. Now, there could be people who were very advanced that were capable of that, but it'd be very rare, right? So with Christianity, we finally get the image of the personal angel and the guardian angel because we ourselves are now individuals. So now we can see the spiritual world in an individuated way. We can now see the individual angel that guides us instead of when we're in a group soul, in a hive mind, and we have a group angel. So before Christ, hive mind, group angel, communal tribal consciousness with a folk spirit or an archangel that guides the group, guides the region. That creates the differences in culture and languages. It's actually the influence of a certain archangel. After the incarnation of Christ, humanity shifts into a period of individuation, and we now are able to view the cosmos objectively, and we now can see our personal angel. And because of that, we can now represent distinct qualities within ourselves that lead to our path of glorification, which would not have been possible because everything before was outside of us in nature or in the group. Okay. So it's very important that we again understand this distinct shift and the mission of our time in part, and also that's part of the importance of the incarnation of Christ, just on a practical level, is understanding individuation. And it's funny because when I talk about it, people are like, "Oh, are you talking about like Carl Jung? Like, are you talking about like like the psychological concept of individuation?" It's like, no, actually, this concept is an esoteric Christian concept. It's a Christian concept. It's not a Jungian concept. Jung got this from the impulse that emerges when Christ enters the world, which is now we're all redeemed. Now we're all individuals. Now we may all evolve according to our own relationship with God as an individual. So the idea of individuality is fundamentally a Christian concept. It's not a psychological concept. It's describing the shift within the soul from a collectivist condition to an individual condition, which happens with the incarnation of Christ. When the kingdom of heaven becomes within man, man is now an individual. So it's actually not, yes, Jung talks about it and these different psychologists talk about it, but the psychologists get it because it's a spiritual reality. The mystics had it first, okay? The spirituality had that one first. And I say that because I see a lot of spiritual truths and realities get dissolved and boiled down into like a mental intellectual construct, and then the spiritual aspect is lost. Like people will just be like, "Oh yeah, like Christ Christ isn't a real person. Christ isn't a real deity. Christ is an archetype. Christ is just an archetypal imagined thing." And it's like, "No, Christ is a real spiritual being." And Jesus was a man who bore the Christ within him. Okay, these are real spiritual beings. These are real angels and spiritual beings and real people that do these massive feats for humanity. It's a real process. It's a real historical process and a real spiritual being. It's not an archetype. It's not representing a quality within the whatever it is. It's a real being and a real history, a real person. These are real things, right? The same thing with like the Whore of Babylon. That's not an archetypal symbol. That's a real deity. That's a real entity, okay? The same thing with Lucifer. That's a real entity. Lucifer is not a concept of that represents human freedom. It's not a concept. Okay, so psychology gets a little crazy sometimes by calling things concepts and archetypes and symbols when the concepts, archetypes, and symbols are telling you about real spiritual beings and real events that are playing out within our consciousness because they happened and they're instrumental in who we are. Okay. So through Christianity, we get the reality of the guardian angel, the personal angel. And here are some quotes about the guardian angel by different figures in spirituality. I think particularly Catholicism tends to really bring this teaching to the forefront. There's a lot of mystical aspects of Catholicism um, that are very beautiful, actually. So this one is from Saint John Bosco, and he says, when tempted, invoke your angel. He is more eager to help you than you are to be helped. When tempted, invoke your angel. He is more eager to help you than you are to be helped. That is sassy, St. John Bosco. Ignore the devil and do not be afraid of him. He trembles and flees at the sight of your guardian angel. Okay, so St. John Bosco is saying, call upon your angel. You know, he's there to help you more than we're willing to surrender to him. And you're not surrendering your identity or anything. You're just willing to be open to the impulses that will that will help you achieve your glorification. Okay. Saint Jerome. How great is the dignity of souls that each person has from birth received an angel to protect it. How great is the dignity of souls that each person has from birth received an angel to protect it. And you can see how, like, again, talking about the guardian angel has been fascinating because some people refuse to acknowledge the guardian angel and they want to just say, oh, this is your higher self or this is your future self. That is actually the old atavistic clairvoyance that does not understand the individual, doesn't understand the concept of individuation, and doesn't understand the idea of the guardian angel. It's still trapped in that prior period where there's only the folk soul, and you just release yourself through meditation into the folk soul, into the folk spirit, and have a spiritual experience. And then, like, it's just this aspect of yourself. It's just an aspect of this, an aspect of that. That is the old atavistic clairvoyance that does not include the embodied perspective of the individual, which then begins to see the cosmos as beings, as a series of beings within beings within beings. So all of the simulation talk, all of the hologram talk, it's your higher self. It's not it's not a separate being. Yeah, because that's the old atavistic clairvoyance, perceiving the world as a hologram. That's a modern way of seeing it as a hive, right? A computer simulation. That may be the experience that you're having, but that's not the objective reality of the cosmos. That's the old atavistic clairvoyance at work that needs to be deepened through Christ into real clairvoyance. Saint Therese of Lisieux. My holy guardian angel, cover me with your wing. With your fire, light the road I am taking. Come, direct my steps. Help me. I call upon you just for today. Let's do that one again. My holy guardian angel, cover me with your wing. With your fire, light the road that I am taking. Come, direct my steps. Help me. I call upon you just for today. Thank you, Saint Therese. I really felt that one. Okay, this one is from Saint Basil the Great, or Basil the Great. Don't want to insult him. Beside each believer stands an angel as protector and shepherd, leading him in life. Beside each believer stands an angel as a protector and shepherd, leading him to life. leading him to life, eternal life. Here is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who did a beautiful prayer series about the guardian angel. I couldn't use it all, but there's part of it. Okay, so here's what he said. We should show our affection for the angels, for one day they will be our co-heirs, as here below they are our guardians and trustees appointed and set over us by the Father. We should show our affection for the angels, for one day they will be our co-heirs, just as here below they are our guardians and trustees appointed and set over us by the Father. They will be our co-heirs. That's some real Christian esotericism there. Real powerful. Okay. With such bodyguards, what are we to fear? With such bodyguards, what are we to fear? They can neither be subdued nor deceived, nor is there any possibility at all that they should go astray. So this is the protection that we have from our angels with such bodyguards. What are we to fear? We are never alone. They are always by your side, and it is us who keep them away through our ignorance, through our inability to acknowledge them, through our immoral acts, through our desire for impulse rather than glory. We push them away. With such bodyguards, what do we fear? They can neither be subdued nor deceived, nor is there any possibility at all that they should go astray. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and his sermon on the angel. He has given his angels charge over you to guard you in all of your ways. Let us be devoted and grateful for such great guardians. Let us love them in return and honor them as much as we can. He has given his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways. Let us be devoted and grateful for such great guardians. Let us love them in return and honor them as much as we can. I really recommend his sermon on the angel, the guardian angel. It really shows we can see this reciprocity of the angel and the human being and how important it is, how protected we are, and how we just need call on them. How we just need to call on the hierarchies, pray to them, bring them into our life, and we would have a different world entirely. That now that we know about them, we can be with them, we can be like them, because we are of them and they are of us. And they reveal our path to glory through Christ. Okay, one more. Well, I think two more. Two more. If you remembered the presence of your angel and the angels of your neighbors, you would avoid many of the foolish things that slip into your conversations. Saint Josimara Escrivida. If you remembered the presence of your angel and the angels of your neighbors, you would avoid many of the foolish things which slip into your conversations. So the angels always getting us to reach for higher branches every moment of the day, every part of our existence. There is a higher way to be, a more moral and justified way to be. And our angel provides that impulse for us. And we need to attune to it, attune to our guardian angel that is guiding us in every single moment for our highest protection, for our highest good, to confront every fear we have, every lower urge we have. There is no shame, there is no embarrassment, there is none of that with them. And this is our key to a higher condition. We have to know that. We have to know the mechanics of this. Hildegard von Bingen. O angels, you who guard the people in your care, whose form reflects in a flash upon your face. Beside each believer stands an angel as protector and shepherd, leading him to life. Yeah. All right. So that is our discussion today. Um, I hope through this presentation we have covered a lot of the key points about how we have seen angels in our past all the way up to our present. And then in the future, um, maybe that would be a different lecture, but we essentially basically join them, you know, as the saint said earlier, we're co-heirs in heaven with them, and our soul can be developed to the point where we're at the level of an angel, just with different faculties, with a few more faculties, right? And there will come a development after the earth, the completion of the earth as we know it, where a new element will be developed, and we will be, you know, if we can do well in our lives, we will be like an angelic figure to um, other beings that emerge, just as we are kind of an angelic figure to animals and plants and minerals. So the teaching of the spiritual hierarchies of the angels is very beautiful, and it's really, you know, what is missing in spirituality. And again, we keep trying to create these weird constructs with um, the idea of technology and aliens and these old atavistic images that keep arising, and we keep repeating them. And you know, I think that this is really where we're going to get the most out of it, because as we started the beginning of this lecture, we can talk about spiritual things all day long. We can talk about dimensions and time machines and different planes and fallen angels and Atlantis and the soul and all of that. But the key is that when we discuss it, we want to talk about it in a way that actually develops your soul, that actually evolves you. Because you can talk about, you know, the chakra system, you can talk about the third eye, you can talk about any spiritual, the angel, but you can do it in a way where it's not evolving you at all. It's just a kind of intellectualism, it's a kind of curiosity, or what's being discussed has such little to no stewardship that when it's being discussed in a way that is completely inverted, and it's not leading you to creating a cosmology and an idea of the human being and an idea of the cosmos in which you can actually evolve and grow. So that's what we have to be careful for in this time of empty intellectualism and scientism and dogmatism and Luciferian spirituality, is discussing things and, you know, creating images and pictures of things that are just not true, or interacting with ideas in a way that don't represent and don't produce life in the human being, don't evolve the human being. So we want that good stewardship. We want that good potency, that good stewardship, because when we talk about these things, um, there's really no point unless it leads to our immortality. There's no point in talking about a dimension or a spiritual being or a spiritual plane or even advanced technology. There's no point in talking about any of that stuff unless it leads to your spiritualization. It leads to your immortality. It leads to you becoming, you know, a higher glorified being. There's literally no point. So we need good stewardship, and we need to talk about these things in a way that leads us there, rather than getting lost in these bizarre images that use spiritual words, that use spiritual concepts, that reference it, that reference the Bible, that reference like the Enuma Elish or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever spiritual text, but talk about it in such a stupid way, a backwards way, that you may as well not talk about it at all, because you're not even talking about it in the way in which it was written. So this babble situation we're in, where we're ironically kind of all speaking the same language, English, but the spiritual concepts are backwards and inverted and not at all represented properly. And that's going to come through only the internal knowledge of the individual, the development of the self-consciousness, self-awareness is what allows us to do that. And the connection with the angel, which is really the unifying of your mind with God's mind, your will with God's will. Okay, so let's close this out here. Okay. Every human being has assigned to them a guardian angel or a personal angel. This is a separate spiritual being from the hierarchy of angels. And this angel guides us through our life and provides the template for our higher development and future condition. Again, I want to say this one more time. So your guardian angel is not just leading you and telling you, don't take that way to work tomorrow. It's, or you need to do this or do that in a mundane way. They're actually representing to you your future condition. And through their enmeshment with you, you're able to perceive and understand the future condition of humanity, which is an angelic condition. In Anthroposophy, this condition is called spirit self. In the East, it's associated with manas, and humanity kind of gets to that phase after we go through our earthly development, okay? So the angel represents back to us, reflects to us our own potential, our own ability to potentially be like that. And that has to be done by a being, right? We have to develop to that condition. We're not already in that condition. We have to develop to that condition. We have an immortal core, but that immortal core has to be realized in all of our spiritual bodies, which are not realized yet. If it was, we would be perfect. We would be Christ, right? So it's the realization of our perfection in our physical, astral, and etheric body. That's called glorification, that the angel helps us to realize. Okay? We need that assistance. And of course, they have beings guiding them as part of their assistance. So they represent the future condition of the human being. However, humanity had to evolve to the condition where we could perceive the personal angel. We had to evolve to this place to even be able to see that. As in earlier times, namely before the incarnation, humanity did not sense their personal guardian angel. Instead, they sensed only the archangel or the folk spirit who guided a group of people. As humanity matured and moved uh, towards individuation, people gradually began to release the spiritual perception rooted in collectivism and began to gain a more embodied individualistic perception. That's the difference between atavistic clairvoyance and real clairvoyance. Here, the personal guardian angel emerged. Today, thousands of years after the Platonic era, the personal angel is common knowledge. And now our task is to rise to the level of our angel, or understand and develop certain qualities that the angel radiates down towards us as impulses. So now that we can perceive the angel and we understand the concept, it's been in Christianity for 2000 years. It was beginning before the incarnation of Christ to prepare for this level. Now that we know the guardian angels there, now we have to learn how to work with them. Now we have to learn how to be moral. Now we have to unite our will with God's will. Now we have to understand the Christ. Now we have to understand the Christ within us. Now we have to overcome lower urges, attachment, materiality, and truly live a spiritual life in order to glorify ourselves. So this is our task now. And then the future civilization, the civilization after the Anglo-German civilization, which we're in right now, will move into a higher civilization, which is one of brotherhood and sisterhood. So our current fifth civilization, the one after the Greek civilization, our fifth civilization, is all about sort of confronting evil and truly arising out of the ashes of the sort of harms of an unrealized kind of collectivism. So the harms of being unself-aware, not being self-aware, not being self-conscious. We rise out of that into a higher form of collectivity, which is the culture of brotherly and sisterly love, which is the sixth civilization, which is the civilization after our own, um, which is also embodied by Venus. And so once we kind of get through this really rough period where we have to confront evil, we have to become personally realized and embodied and become self-conscious and attune properly with God. We go through this, we finally start to get into the real form of collectivism, which is when you have individuals who have individualized from the collective that now are God realized to some degree, who operate morally and form a civilization not around tribe, not around blood, not around different whatever concepts of the past, but around the natural laws of God, around the natural moral impulses of human beings. And that's what brings in the sixth great civilization, which will happen in the Russian Slavic region in a few thousand years. And that will be the civilization of brotherly and sisterly love that will emerge out of the Christian impulse. And so that's kind of where we're leaving. It's like we begin from a place of tribal collectivism, and then we return to this higher sense of community through the objective knowledge of the self or God, which we never had in the first place. So, in the earlier period of our tribal hive mind from Lemuria into Atlantis, and humanity wasn't an individual, it was a kind of collectivism, like a baby is dependent on a parent. And we're kind of like in the teenager phase. And then we get into this higher condition in the sixth civilization in a few thousand years. I think it's, don't quote me on this, but I think it's 3,000. It's after the civilization. You can type it in the comments below. I'm bad with numbers. We get to that point, and we have this new renewed sense of brotherly and sisterly love because everybody is self-realized, not only self-realized, but God realized. And when that happens, everyone operates in a kind of higher hive where we're all moral and all understanding the objective laws of spirit. And that's when real things start to happen, because nothing is dependent on the material world like it was in earlier periods. And it's this real higher way of life, which we get into later on. So that is sort of the distinction between a advanced collective, like a group of people that are forming a civilization under the conscious knowledge and experience with God that everybody can see and understand through their own experience. They're all realizing it's all the same. That's true spiritual realization compared to earlier collectivism, in which there is no individuation, there is no embodiment, there is no self-consciousness or self-awareness. That's the difference. We're in the in-between point of individuation now. That is the esoteric view of the human soul through the seven characters of illumination, the seven phases of illumination of the soul. Just like the earth was created in 7 days. So this number of seven is key. We're in the fifth, and then you get into the sixth and the seventh, and this is the exalted form. So we're in the fourth and the fifth are this really tumultuous time where there's this individuation period, confronting evil, separating from the tribe, all of that. And then we get into this higher condition, and then things recapitulate all over again in a new stage. That is the esoteric viewpoint. Okay, you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget, I have a new class coming up. It is called Your Guardian Angel and Spirit Guides with Gigi Young. I can't wait to start teaching that in the coming weeks. I'm just getting it all together. It's going to have a huge PDF booklet, and I'm going to cover every question you could think of from we're going to get into mediumship a little bit, um, signs, symbols, and synchronicities, how the angel communicates with the human being, more about how the angel is embedded in the astral body, this kind of stuff. It's going to be really deep, but it's also going to be fun. And so I hope to see you there. I should have some more information on the sign up page there now. Do keep checking back. And also, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm completely supported by you. So anytime you share my video or like it or comment, that really helps me. You can also make a donation on my website if you like this talk. And sign up for my announcements letter. So I will email you anytime I'm going to be live and doing a lecture or anything I have going on. But if you sign up at the course page, I'll only let you know when I have the course due. I won't I won't fill your email boxes with other things that I'm doing. Um, I think that's it, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Also, if you have any questions, I do a live Q&A every month on my member site. So if you have any questions you want to know, leave it in the comments or join my members platform where I do a monthly Q&A and take in all your questions. I'll also do some exclusive stuff there. So don't miss it. Don't miss out on the incredible community that's going on over there. I mean, the forum is incredible. If you're wanting that sense of community, but having it be a spiritual community of like-minded people, there's no place like the forums on Gigi Young. So I hope you guys want to check that out. And as always, you guys, all my love your way. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in our next stream.